Welcome to Real Crime Reports. Today, we tell the chilling story of a couple who attempted to push the boundaries of their relationship in unconventional ways. What began as an innocent attempt to explore a shared fantasy quickly turned into a dangerous game that spiraled out of control. What started as an experiment soon evolved into a dark tale of obsession, betrayal, and ultimately a tragic crime. They took the risk of testing their emotional and relational limits, but what they found was far more than they could have ever imagined. Trust, once the foundation of their love, was shattered in a storm of jealousy and dangerous secrets. How far can one go in a relationship before the consequences become irreversible? The couple lives in the small town of Marion, Ohio, where life is quiet and uneventful. Both are in their mid-30s and seem to lead a typical life in an American small town. Their routine is well established, and their relationship appears, at first glance, to be stable. Jake, 38 years old, works as an engineer at a small construction company. He is a quiet, introverted man who takes his work seriously and values structure. In his free time, he spends most of his hours at home, reading, jogging, or working on his old car. Jake is reliable and responsible, but sometimes a bit too yielding, especially when it comes to emotional or intimate matters. He assumes everything is fine as long as there are no conflicts and tends to avoid uncomfortable conversations. Lena, 35 years old, is an outgoing and energetic woman. She works as a marketing manager at a digital advertising agency and loves being creative. Lena is very successful in her work and has a large circle of friends. She is social, often organizing events, and is very popular among her friends. But behind her lively facade lies a deep dissatisfaction that she has never truly addressed. Her marriage to Jake has become somewhat routine over the years, and Lena often feels misunderstood, though she has never voiced it. In recent years, she has felt that her sexual desires and needs have been neglected in the relationship. Despite the obvious differences and the somewhat stagnant dynamic in their marriage, Jake and Lena share a deep, though often unspoken bond. Their days mostly follow the same pattern: work, evenings on the couch, and occasional outings. Yet a sense of emptiness begins to seep into their daily life, and Lena starts searching for ways to fill that void. It is this dissatisfaction that will eventually lead to a decision that will change everything. In recent months, Lena had become increasingly dissatisfied in her relationship with Jake. Their sex life had become monotonous, and the once fiery passion seemed to be fading. She longed for change but didn't know how to express her desires, fearing Jake might not understand her. Lena had a fantasy that had been occupying her mind for a while. She imagined being intimate with another man while Jake was there watching. The thought fascinated her, but she knew it was an unusual fantasy. One evening, Lena gathered the courage to share her thoughts with Jake. She explained that their relationship needed something new to reignite the passion and carefully brought up her fantasy. She assured him that she didn't want to jeopardize their relationship, but she was curious about how this experience might affect their bond. Jake was surprised and confused. Up until that point, he had never felt that anything was missing in their relationship. The idea of Lena being intimate with another man was difficult for him to understand and completely new. He didn't know how to react. After a few days of thinking and hesitation, Jake withdrew to process the idea. Lena gave him the space he needed and respected his concerns. Finally, after a week, Jake decided to fulfill Lena's wish. Even though he was still uncertain, he knew their relationship was important to him, and he was willing to at least give it a try. Together, they began searching online for a suitable partner. On specialized platforms dealing with alternative relationship dynamics, they browsed profiles and looked for someone who met their expectations. They discussed their hopes and what they hoped to gain from this new experience. Although aware of the uncertainties, they were determined to try this experiment and explore their relationship in a new way. After Lena and Jake spent several days searching for a suitable partner, they came across Ethan, a 24-year-old man whose profile immediately attracted them. Ethan had a calm, self-assured presence, was muscular, and placed a high value on fitness. In his messages, he was charming and respectful, knowing exactly how to pique Lena's interest without being pushy. Lena found him fascinating. He had a mix of youthful energy and maturity that appealed to her. Despite his age, She felt secure and understood by the way he communicated with her. Ethan responded to her messages with empathy and directness, something she hadn't experienced in her relationship with Jake for a long time. It was as if he understood her desires and fantasies without crossing her boundaries. Over the weeks of messaging, Lena felt an increasing sense of excitement. Ethan responded to her ideas without threatening her relationship, and their conversations were always respectful and stimulating. Lena appreciated his self-confidence and the way he understood her without judgment. After a week of exchanging messages, they agreed to meet in person for the first time. Lena was nervous but also excited. She knew this step was important, yet something about Ethan drew her in, and she was looking forward to their upcoming meeting. Jake was also curious to see how it would go. The first meeting took place in a quiet cafe, as Lena and Jake wanted to ensure that Ethan was the right man for their experiment. When Ethan entered the room, they immediately noticed his confident yet reserved presence. He was punctual, dressed casually, and had a charming smile that created a relaxed atmosphere. The conversation flowed easily, and they talked about general topics as well as their expectations. Ethan was empathetic and respectful, which helped Lena and Jake open up to him. Jake observed Ethan closely, but despite his polite behavior, there was a certain skepticism on his face. He was still uncertain, but could imagine going along with it for Lena's sake. Lena was drawn to Ethan's natural demeanor and felt her nervousness gradually turn into anticipation. She was confident that he was the right man. Jake remained more reserved but was willing to do it for Lena. At the end of the meeting, they agreed to have the next encounter at their home to see how the dynamic would develop. Lena was excited, while Jake was still unsure but ready to take the next step. They set the date for the following day. The next day, the preparations were filled with nervousness and tension. Lena and Jake had established clear rules before taking the step. The most important one was that the safety and trust in their relationship always came first. They agreed that Jake could stop the situation at any time if he felt uncomfortable, and that there would be no physical closeness between Lena and Ethan without Jake's consent. When Ethan finally arrived at their home, the atmosphere was tense, yet expectant. Jake still felt uncertain and observed Ethan with a mix of curiosity and skepticism. It was difficult to keep control over his emotions, but he wanted to continue for Lena's sake. The first hour of the meeting was relatively calm. They talked and got to know each other better, but Jake could feel the nervousness grow with each passing moment. When the time came for Lena and Ethan to get closer, Jake was torn inside. Lena seemed to open up more and more, and Jake couldn't help but observe the situation with mixed feelings. Lena appeared completely at ease, while Ethan treated her with respect and empathy. Jake struggled with his own feelings of insecurity and jealousy, but he didn't want to disappoint Lena. He tried to step back and accept what was happening, but seeing her live out her fantasy with another man was difficult for him. Still, he endured because he knew how important this step was for Lena. The evening passed in a tense yet calm atmosphere. When Ethan finally left, there was an uncomfortable tension in the air that neither Lena nor Jake could quite place. Jake felt exhausted, confused, and uncertain, but he didn't want to disappoint Lena, so he reassured her that everything was fine. He admitted that he felt uncomfortable but was trying to respect her wishes. Lena, who felt genuinely excited by the experience, was relieved that everything had gone according to plan. She picked up her phone and immediately sent Ethan a message, thanking him for the meeting, saying that she had enjoyed it and would like to repeat the experience. Ethan quickly and kindly replied, and it seemed that the dynamic between the three of them was continuing to evolve. In the following days and weeks, there were more meetings. Lena was full of energy and excitement after each date, but Jake found it harder to suppress his feelings. At first, he thought that with time, everything would fall into place, that the uncertainty and discomfort would eventually fade. But the opposite happened. Every time Ethan was at their house, Jake felt more and more excluded and distant. Lena seemed to focus more and more on Ethan, while Jake remained on the sidelines as an observer. Despite the repeated meetings and attempts to adjust to the situation, the feeling of discomfort didn't go away. On the contrary, it grew, and Jake began to feel more and more alienated from Lena. The initial hope for an improvement in their relationship slowly turned into frustration and detachment. After another meeting with Ethan, Jake felt increasingly uncomfortable. The past few weeks had been weighing heavily on him, and he could no longer ignore the growing tensions in the relationship. One evening, he pulled Lena aside and told her that he wanted to end the experiment. He explained that he felt more and more excluded and uneasy whenever Ethan was with them. Despite his attempts to adjust, he could no longer suppress the uncomfortable feelings. Lena listened to him, but her reaction was different than he expected. She understood his concerns, but for her, the experience with Ethan was something she couldn't give up. She explained that she felt alive when she was living out this fantasy, and it awakened a thrill in her that she needed. She reassured Jake that she didn't want to hurt him, but she had decided to continue pursuing these desires, even if it meant doing so in secret. Jake felt a rift opening between them. He knew he couldn't change Lena's decision, but the sense of alienation he felt had grown too large for him to continue. Lena, on the other hand, was determined to carry on with her fantasy and planned to continue meeting Ethan secretly without Jake knowing. Their relationship had reached a turning point, and it was clear that they would be going down different paths. In the following weeks, Lena met with Ethan more and more frequently in secret. What had started as a one-time experiment turned into a hidden relationship. Lena sought the thrill and the forbidden, and Ethan gave her exactly what she needed. Their meetings became more regular, and Jake began to notice the changes. Lena was often away for hours, supposedly with friends or shopping, and she spent a lot of time on her phone, always with a secretive look on her face. Even though Jake noticed, he didn't want to believe it. He couldn't imagine that Lena was hiding something from him, especially since she had promised to be honest. But the distance between them grew, and the pain in his eyes became impossible to ignore. One afternoon, when Jake came home unexpectedly early, he immediately sensed that something was wrong. As he entered the bedroom, he froze. Lena and Ethan were lying together in their marital bed. The shock was overwhelming. Jake stood frozen in the doorway, unable to process what he was seeing. Lena jumped up in shock, trying to dress herself, but Jake remained frozen, his eyes a mixture of disappointment, anger, and confusion. Ethan, also surprised, tried to collect himself. The silence between the three of them was unbearable. Lena stammered something, but Jake couldn't believe her anymore. The trust was shattered, and the betrayal was too much for him to bear. Jake spent the night at a hotel, completely overwhelmed by the events of the previous day. The images of Lena and Ethan in the bedroom were burned into his memory, and he couldn't gather a coherent thought. In his despair, he didn't know what to do. The disappointment and anger over what he had seen made it impossible for him to return to the house. He stayed alone in the hotel room, trying to sleep, but the silence was suffocating. While Jake was far away from home, life continued at the house. Lena had an appointment with her sister for the morning, but when she arrived at the agreed time, there was no answer. She rang the bell, knocked on the door, and called for Lena, all to no avail. Worried, she eventually pulled out the spare house key she had for emergencies and opened the door. It was silent, too silent. An uneasy feeling crept over her. She went further into the house, called out again for her sister, but there was no response. When she finally reached the bedroom, she froze. Lena was lying motionless on the floor, completely still. Her sister rushed to her, but there was nothing she could do. The body was cold, her eyes wide open as if she had died in her sleep, but something about it felt wrong. In panic, her sister pulled out her phone and immediately dialed the police. Her voice trembled as she made the emergency call, asking for help. Minutes later, the officers arrived, and as they entered the house, they immediately began their investigation. But what they found was more than just a tragic incident. It was the beginning of a case that ran deeper than they could have ever imagined. Lena lay lifeless on the floor, the room untouched and almost eerily calm. But beneath this stillness lay a brutal crime, and the investigation began. First, the crime scene was systematically searched, with the detectives securing all traces of evidence. No obvious injuries were visible, which made the investigation even more complicated. But in such a confined space where every step could be observed, it was only a matter of time before the first suspects emerged. Jake, the husband, was of course the first to come under suspicion. He was not at the house at the time of the murder and had apparently not noticed the crime. But his sudden disappearance and the palpable tension in the relationship raised concerns with the police. The conversation he had with Lena before leaving the house left many questions unanswered. What was the real reason for his absence and his abrupt departure? Had he and Lena had an argument that might have escalated? It was clear that he had a potential motive. However, Ethan, the third party involved, also attracted the attention of the investigators. During the search of Lena's phone, they found numerous messages suggesting a clear emotional bond between the two. Their communication had gone far beyond what was originally intended as a one-time encounter. The police speculated that there might have been more between them than just an affair, perhaps a jealousy conflict or an argument that led to a fatal outcome. But who was the murderer? The clues were contradictory, and the investigation was still in its early stages. The police had to weigh all possibilities before they could identify the true culprit. Jake learned of Lena's death when her sister contacted him. The news hit him like a blow. At first, he couldn't believe it. Lena was dead, and he hadn't even been there when it happened. A wave of horror overwhelmed him. After the initial shock, he was contacted by the investigators, who wanted to hear his version of events. Jake stated that he had spent the night in a hotel to escape the tense relationship. However, the hotel surveillance footage contradicted his story. It turned out that he had left the hotel in the evening and returned an hour later, which made his alibi incomplete. Neighbors reported hearing a loud argument that night and had seen Jake's car in the driveway, which raised further doubts about his version. These clues led to Jake's arrest. During the interrogation, the investigators confronted him with the evidence. Under the pressure, he broke down. Jake confessed to the murder and explained how it had happened. The argument with Lena had escalated, driven by disappointment and pain over her betrayal. The secret meetings with Ethan had overwhelmed him. In a moment of anger and desperation, he lost control. It had not been a premeditated act, but an impulsive reaction to the feeling of betrayal. After Jake confessed to the murder, the legal proceedings began. The police secured all the evidence and presented it in court. The prosecution argued that Jake's actions were driven by jealousy and emotional overwhelm, which led to a rapid escalation of the conflict. However, his defense team attempted to frame the act as an impulsive reaction to his wife's betrayal. Despite this, the fact remained that there had been no direct threat from Lena before he killed her. Ultimately, Jake was found guilty of murder and sentenced to a long prison term. The trial dragged on for several months and was an emotional burden for all those involved. Jake's family and friends tried to support him, but the gravity of his crime and the reasons behind it sparked their own doubts and conflicts. Lena's family and friends had to cope with the loss of a beloved person and the dramatic betrayal that came with it. Her sister, who had found Lena's body, was especially plagued by feelings of guilt. She constantly wondered if there was more she could have done to prevent the murder. The fact that Lena had been secretly involved with Ethan in the final months only deepened the tragedy for those who knew her. Ethan, who had become central to the scandal due to his relationship with Lena, now had to face the consequences of his own choices. Although he was never suspected as a direct participant in the murder, he was still deeply implicated in the scandal. He faced intense public criticism, with many people beginning to see him as the betrayer who had destroyed Jake and Lena's marriage. Ethan felt disappointed and hurt by the events, even though he wasn't aware of his responsibility for the murder. The whole situation had placed him in a difficult position, where he had to confront his own emotions and understand the truth of his role in this tragic incident. In prison, Jake became increasingly absorbed in his own actions and the decisions he had made. Trying to rationalize his anger and disappointment did not bring him any peace. He was overwhelmed by feelings of guilt and struggled with the thought that, in a moment of complete loss of control, he had taken Lena's life. The psychological consequences of the murder haunted him, and he tried to come to terms with his inner demons. The end of the case raises the question of how far pain and betrayal can drive a person. The tragedy of Jake, Lena, and Ethan highlights how complex interpersonal relationships and emotional overwhelm can lead to devastating consequences. While justice was served for Lena and her family, the loss remained deeply felt by all involved. But the lingering question remains: could there have been another way to deal with personal emotions and disappointments without leading to such a tragic end? And how many relationships are willing to step into these dark depths without fully realizing the consequences? What do you think about this case? Leave your thoughts in the comments. We look forward to your insights and discussions.